Hi, Rod Fleming again. Now, I have been asked, and shout out, thanks for your support, by one of my followers on YouTube called MadeByReuben. Hi, Reuben. And I'm sorry I really got confused about you, but I think we're over that now. Okay, and he said, would I make a video about female to masculine transgenderism? And I was kind of reluctant because I haven't read into that anything like as much as I have into the other one, masculine to feminine, and that's for very, very simple reasons. There are a number of things to observe about FtM, female to masculine. The first is that numerically they have historically been much smaller in numbers. The Dutch study, which was perhaps the only time this has ever been really side-by-side tested, showed that roughly 3 times as many MTFs were found in that population as FTMs. Women's sexuality is very, very complicated. It's not anything like as simple as men's is. Men's are really simple. They're very target-oriented, you know. Identify the target, have sex with the target, and move on to the next target. Except they're conditioned by this notion that in order to get your genes to actually reach the next generation, you had better stick around and help look after the kids. Okay, so that's really quite a simple thing, conditioned by an evolutionary requirement that your children actually do make it to reproductive age themselves. For women, it's totally different. Their sexuality is incredibly complicated because, in the first place, for a woman, having sex is a really dangerous thing to do. You might get pregnant. And being pregnant, let's go back to the time when we were, before we lived in cities and we lived in wandering hunter-gatherer groups. Well, a pregnant woman immediately has a problem. The first one is that for her third trimester, she's going to have real difficulties in just keeping up with a wandering group. I have 4 children, and I watched my wife go through her third trimester 4 times. And, this is not something any guy is going to sign up for, Let's be honest. Men don't realise how lucky they are about some things. Not about everything, but about that one. So, a woman has to be careful. She has to, and childbirth, right, for a woman is dangerous. You walk around any 19th century or earlier graveyard in your area, if you live in an area that's been populated for a while, and look at all the gravestones of women who died as very young women, died in childbirth. For humans, because we stand up, childbirth is difficult. It's far more difficult than it is for animals whose bodies are rotated with a right angle at the hips, which allows the pelvis to be completely different in shape. It doesn't have to have the strong bony case that it does in humans to support all this heavy weight up here. So it's a completely different form than you'd find, say, in chimpanzees. We split from chimpanzees about 8 million years ago, So it's a lot easier for chimpanzee girls to have babies than it is for human girls, right? So that's another thing that makes it... So all of these things together, and then, the woman has to consider how is she going to support her children. Because once you've had a baby, human babies are born with somewhat advanced brains, very large heads and brains. That's one of the problems that women have in delivery. But their bodies are extremely undeveloped. I mean, it takes a year for most human babies to learn to walk. It takes antelopes a day, Human babies have their body development slowed deliberately. It's an evolutionary process that does this, but an evolved process that does this, but they're deliberately slowed in order to give their brains time to develop to the kind of power and capacity that an adult human brain has. So for at least 12 years, human babies are totally dependent on their mother, or their parents if they're both together. And in our societies, we tend to extend that a little bit longer, but that's kind of artificial. In simpler societies, teenage boys and girls are actually self-sufficient. They can live on their own. Whether they do or not depends on the culture, but they actually could, if you see what I mean. So, if you take all these things together, women have a lot of reasons to be extremely choosy about with whom they have sex, when they have sex. That means they're constantly thinking about their own power over their own body, right? That's really the most important thing to a woman, is that she has the ability to say no. Right? Men don't say no. You know, it's not really part of our vocabulary. You know, with sex going, yeah, I'll have some of that. Do you see what I mean? It's just different, you know. And so when we look at transsexualism, one of the fascinating things about transsexualism is it helps you to look at these differences and say, oh, I can see why that's happening now. As I said, in a Dutch study, we found that there were far fewer in number than the male to feminine. And this is probably because they lack, or in that study, they lacked a female equivalent to autogynephilia, to the non-homosexual. In fact, all of the trans men who were counted in that study were actually homosexual. They were attracted to women from a very young age, and they adopted in their relationships with women the way that they think men would, the behaviours that they thought were appropriate for men. They become protective of other women, they become defensive, they become quite aggressive against men in protecting women. And so they're actually showing quite masculine attitudes, and these come from the relationship that they have to women. So just as we've said before, you know, you get a clustering of characteristics which are typical of male to female. You get a clustering of characteristics which are typical of female to male. The one thing that doesn't seem to be quite as commonplace amongst female to males is that there are really specific body types associated with male to feminine. And this seems to be less the case for female to male. It's possible that trans men tend to be naturally a little bit heavier built than most women, but I've never seen any evidence to back that up. What seems to bulk them out is when they start taking testosterone, you know, when they start to put on upper body strength, things like that, muscle. So that's one group, you know. Now, they're really easy to understand. They're as easy to understand as male to female homosexual transsexuals are, you know. They are not transsexual because they're lesbian. Their attraction to women is one of the parameters that within a group of parameters defines the homosexual female to masculine, just as it defines the homosexual masculine to feminine. It's actually quite simple. Now, in recent years, we have come across a phenomenon that seems to equate somewhat to the non-homosexual phenomenon that we find in male to feminine. Now, remember, non-homosexual male to feminine are motivated by autogynephilia. That is a passionate desire to be a woman and to, Larry Blanchard's words, autogynephilia is a man's propensity to be sexually aroused at the thought or image of himself as a woman. Now, are women exhibiting something equivalent that we might call autoandrophilia? And yes and no, basically. Because women's sexuality is so different from men's, women are not target oriented in the way that men are. They just aren't. Females just aren't. So, because they're female, it's an innate difference, you know. Women are socially oriented, right? Males are individually oriented. Males basically, but for that evolutionary imperative that says, well, you know, if you don't stick around and help look after your kids, you know, your genetic line is at an end, pal. They'll just, you know, they'll screw and run. That's what they'll do. They'll have sex with as many women as they can and move on. It's only the fact that, you know, we need to raise our children to independence age that causes the whole human pair bonding thing and that magic stuff, you know, that love stuff. That's why it happens. So you stick together long enough so that your kids have a chance to do the same thing. Women already do that. Women are constantly thinking about the social consequences, the ongoing consequences of sex. So if women are exhibiting a thing that might be called autoandrophilia, it's not what a man would think it would be. It's not, certainly not autogynephilia. Women just don't get autogynephilia because, let's be quite blunt, women don't need to be in love with the idea of being women because they bloody well are women. Sometimes, you know, sometimes the stupid is like a weight on your head. It fucking is. Anyway, this autoandrophilia, if it exists, isn't really sexual in the way that it is for men, because the women's reward circuit is largely social and not sexual. So what are the women in this case looking for? And we seem to be seeing more, particularly in what I call snowflake culture. And it seems to be somehow related to feminism, in that women are attempting to adopt male social positions. All right. Now they're not homosexual. Some of them still remain married to men, or they have married men. And I think we're a long way from understanding the details of how they work in terms of sex. But it's quite clear that what they're actually doing is attempting to adopt a position that they think will give them more authority, because they think males have more authority within the culture. So it's a real socio-cultural phenomenon, whereas the male expression, autogynephilia, is very much a sexual thing. You know, and I'm sorry girls, I know you might not like the fact that autogynephilia is actually sex-based, but it is. It just is. So, in this way, this expression of female to masculine transsexualism is really interesting, and it's quite different from anything that we've really seen in large scale in the West before. I mean, you could look back at the 19th century, look at someone like Georges Sand, the French writer, who was a woman, but she often affected men's clothing and wore top hats, tailcoats, that sort of thing. And it seems to have been that within the society that she moved in, of other writers, the men really did have the authority, and that one way that she could, you know, adopt her authority and demonstrate her authority was to be like the men, you know, to dress like the men, and to seize to herself what she saw as the power characteristics of men. Because remember, women always think in terms of power. It's always about power for those women. It's not a bad thing, it's just the way they think. So she's thinking, right, how do I elevate my power characteristics to the level that the men have? Well, if I look like a man, maybe that'll do it. And I think what we're looking at is something like that. So it's far less directly sexual. It's got to do with... Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that AGP doesn't have a social element. It does. These are, again, you know, remember what trait curves are like. They look like two standard bell curves, but they're shifted slightly. They're just a wee bit different, you know. So there's a huge amount of overlap, but at the extremities they're different. And because they're extremities, they can be quite markedly different. So sorry, this camera doesn't deal with exposure quite as well as the other one. Sorry. So this seems to be held out in the conversations I've had with non-homosexual female to male trans men, that it's very much a social thing, and it has a lot to do with power. Now, what would be interesting, and something I can't answer because I haven't seen research on this, is how these individuals perform sexually. Remember, they are attracted to men and are often in relationships with men. And they may well have had GRS, they may have had a pseudopenis constructed, you know, which with the addition, by the use of modern technology, can actually be made to erect. So what's happening? They're very coy about this, but one wonders and one presumes that in fact they play the role of what are called male tops, gay male tops. That is, that they penetrate the men that they're in relationships with. That is a power understanding, right? That is about the penetrator dominating the penetrated. So again, it comes back to something that is about social parameters. It's about power rather than just about sex. You know, it has ramifications that go on in a way that they don't for men. Sex for men is very basic and very immediate, you know. For women it's not, because of the nature of being a woman and the risks that sex imply. it has enormous ramifications in terms of other behaviours and the way you think and how you think about sex, how you think about your position in society. So it does seem to me that these non-homosexual trans men who have had GRS, they seem, from the conversations I've had, and I know it's limited, the conversations I've had, they seem to be penetrating their male partners. So they're basically they're turning their male partners into women, which is interesting. The homosexual ones are obvious, because if they have GRS, then they'll use their pseudopenis to penetrate women in the same way as a man would. You know, any man would. The trans man who's a homosexual trans man and thus attracted to women will make love to his women partners in exactly the same way as a guy would. You know, he'll penetrate them. The non-homosexual ones, because they aren't homosexual, they retain an attraction towards men, but in sexual practice they seem to do something very complicated. This is an area, I have to say, MadeByReuben, that we need a hell of a lot more research. I mean, I'm talking about a fairly limited number of conversations I've had with FTMs. You know, I have had hundreds upon hundreds of conversations with MTFs over the years. I know so many MTF transsexuals, you know, and an awful, my friends are nearly all TS, for goodness sake, or gay, and that leaves me with a fairly good understanding, and there's a huge amount of science on MTF, so it's really simple to piece it all together and look down and say, well, you know, this is what I find in terms of conversation, this in terms of what I observe, go into the field and I say, well, people are behaving this way, is there science to back it up? Yes, there is, look, bingo, not a problem. That doesn't exist for FTM. There just isn't that level of scientific understanding. And because the numbers worldwide are very, very small in comparison to MTF. Remember, MTF is already a small number. You know, FTM is much smaller. It does appear to be that in cultures where, for example, in what I would call snowflake culture, where the power balance between men and women is somewhat inverted, we see a greater number of these expressions of masculine to feminine transsexualism. But I would have to be the first to say that I've only ever talked to a handful of these people. And very few of them, that's the non-homosexual type, very few of them are really very open about what they do. The homosexual type are pretty open. I mean, they're like homosexual transsexuals, MTF homosexual transsexuals. I mean, if you ask them a question, they'll give you a straight answer. This other type, this one thing they do share with male non-homosexual transsexuals is that the last bloody thing they'll give you is a straight answer to a straight question. You know, they just won't do it. There's always some, you know, confusion being introduced. Why that is, I don't know. I don't know why that is. I don't know why non-homosexual transsexuals are so conflicted by science and truth and simplicity. You know, they have to make everything so bloody complicated. That's all I can really say. That you have the two groups. The one that's always been known the longest, the one being known the longest, is the homosexual group of trans men, and they relate to women exactly in the same way as homosexual transsexuals relate to men. Homosexual male to female transsexuals relate to men. It's the same, you know. Whereas the HSTS will play the girl to my man, an HSTS trans man will play man to his woman. Very simple. It's really straightforward, you know. And in fact, their relationships with their partners, they're not really even homosexual. I mean, they might be a bit bisexual, but they're not really homosexual, because your trans man is always going to play the male role. You know, his partner won't have the ability to return it if he's had GRS. And that's really the same with a male regarding HSTS MTF, is that certainly most of the guys I know, and certainly myself, we penetrate our partners. I mean, they're girls. You know, they want to be taken by us and submit to us and you know, all that stuff that, you know, is incredibly stereotypical and a majorly good fun.